How much is a human life worth? In the 19th century, in the backstreets of London and New York, the answer could be shocking, sometimes less than the price of a loaf of bread. Families so desperate that they sold their own children for a handful of coins. Men and women renting their bodies not for pleasure, but simply for a place to sit and sleep through a freezing night. Imagine paying a single penny not for a bed, not even for a chair, but to lean your exhausted body against a rope strung across a filthy room, your only chance to close your eyes until dawn. These were not isolated tragedies. They were everyday realities for tens of thousands. Yet, history books often hide these details, polishing the past into tales of progress and empire. But behind the grandeur of Victorian mansions and the rise of industrial might lay streets filled with hunger, addiction, and pain. Stories too grim for polite society to remember. In this video, we will peel back the curtain and step into that forgotten world. We will uncover how people survived when survival itself became a daily negotiation. Each chapter will take you deeper, from child auctions and freak shows to secret addictions hidden behind elegant doors. Stay with me until the very end, because every detail will challenge what you thought you knew about the 19th century. And if you love uncovering the raw, untold side of history, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Your support is what keeps these forgotten voices alive. In the crowded alleys of 19th century London, survival was often measured not in days, but in pennies. Imagine walking into a shelter after working yourself to the bone, and instead of a bed, you find a thick rope strung across the room. For a single penny, you could drape your exhausted body over it and doze until morning. This was called the penny sit-up. People weren't paying for comfort, they were paying for the privilege of not collapsing on the cold stone streets. I always try to picture what that must have felt like. The smell of sweat and smoke thick in the air. Dozens of bodies leaning together, snoring, coughing, the rope digging into your chest. And yet, for many, it was still better than nothing. To me, it shows just how far a person will go when survival leaves no room for dignity. And it wasn't only sleep that was for sale. In some neighborhoods, the poor literally rented their bodies out as living mannequins, standing for hours in tailor shops to display clothing, or even volunteering themselves for medical experiments because it meant a warm meal. It's almost unthinkable now, but back then, desperation was stronger than fear. What strikes me most is how normalized it all was. These weren't shocking scandals written in headlines, they were everyday solutions to poverty. That's the chilling part, when suffering becomes so common that society no longer sees it as strange. But survival had other, darker costs too. If adults were willing to sell their sleep and their health, what happened to their children? That's where the story turns even more unsettling. Because entire families began selling their sons and daughters in open street auctions. And that takes us to the next chapter. If adults were forced to rent out their own bodies, imagine the impossible choices parents made for their children. In the early 19th century, across cities like New York and London, there were open-air, child auctions. Families crushed by hunger or debt would bring their sons and daughters to the marketplace and bargain them off to the highest bidder. Sometimes, a boy of 8 was sold for less than the price of a cow, while a girl of 10 might be promised as a maid. Though everyone knew what fate really awaited her, I can't shake the image of a small hand gripping a mother's skirt, not quite understanding what was happening, while strangers haggled loudly over their worth. To me, this is one of the most haunting aspects of history, not just the cruelty, but how public it was. No dark alleys, no secrecy. It was commerce, carried out in broad daylight. Reports from the 1830s describe New York auctions where children were lined up like livestock, examined for strength, teeth, or obedience. And what breaks my heart is realizing how many never saw their families again. A son sent to a factory in Pennsylvania. A daughter shipped to a household in Boston. Their stories scattered, forgotten, unless a newspaper happened to mention the sale. When I read about these things, I try to remind myself that desperation can push people to do the unthinkable. These parents weren't monsters, they were trapped, choosing between watching their children starve or selling them to someone who at least offered bread and shelter. It's a reminder of how fragile dignity becomes when survival is at stake. But children weren't the only ones turned into entertainment or profit. The 19th century also created a different marketplace, where human suffering itself became a spectacle. And that takes us into the bizarre and disturbing world of 19th century entertainment. When we think of entertainment in the 19th century, maybe we imagine grand theaters, orchestras, or elegant balls, but for the working classes, entertainment was often raw, brutal, and built on the suffering of others. Crowds filled dingy basements and smoky taverns to watch rat baiting, where dogs tore through barrels of rats while people placed bets and cheered. It sounds barbaric to us. Yet in those days it was as common as going to a baseball game today. And then there were the freak shows. People with disabilities or unusual bodies were paraded under bright lights. Their pain turned into profit. P.T. Barnum, one of America's most famous showmen, made fortunes exhibiting individuals he branded as curiosities. Some of them became celebrities in their own strange way. But most were trapped, exploited, and laughed at for things they never chose. I often wonder what it must have felt like to stand on that stage. Imagine being a child born with a deformity, hearing strangers roar with laughter at every movement, every glance. To me, it reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. How often we confuse cruelty for amusement when society tells us it is acceptable. And yet, people didn't just pay to watch the unusual. They also paid to watch violence. Public floggings, bare-knuckle fights, even medical demonstrations where living patients screamed in agony. These events drew spectators like moths to a flame. It makes me think about the thin line between entertainment and empathy. The moment pain becomes spectacle, we stop seeing people as human. But the truth is, behind the closed doors of Victorian homes, there were sufferings just as deep, hidden beneath layers of respectability. Women, in particular, carried burdens that history rarely talks about. And that is where we turn next, the silent suffering of women in the 19th century. Step inside a Victorian home and you might see polished furniture, lace curtains, and portraits of proud families. But behind those heavy doors, many women lived in silence, carrying burdens no one dared to speak of. They were praised as the angels of the house. Yet their wings were bound by iron corsets, social rules, and often by bottles of medicine that promised calm but delivered chains of addiction. One of the most common prescriptions for women in the 19th century was laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol. Doctors handed it out for almost anything: nerves, sleeplessness, even hysteria. Imagine being told that your sadness, your frustration, your very voice was a disease that needed to be drugged away. I picture a woman sipping the bitter liquid in the dim glow of a candle, her body relaxing but her soul slipping further into silence. What strikes me is how society admired the image of the calm, obedient wife, without realizing that many were kept calm by force of chemistry. Diaries from the 1840s speak of women unable to function without their daily dose. Yet no one questioned it. To me, that feels less like medicine and more like a quiet prison built inside the body. And it wasn't only drugs. Clothing itself became a form of control. Corsets squeezed women so tightly that fainting was considered fashionable. They were praised for their beauty even while gasping for breath. It's a cruel irony. Society celebrated the image of elegance, while the reality was bruised ribs and restricted lungs. When I think of these women, I don't just see victims. I see resilience hidden beneath silence, strength carried in whispers, and courage in simply enduring another day. But not everyone even had that chance. For the poor, the end of life often brought no dignity at all. Which leads us to a final chapter, where we explore how death itself became another marketplace in the 19th century. For the wealthy of the 19th century, death meant processions, carved headstones, and family plots lined with flowers. But for the poor, death was not an ending with dignity, it was often just another transaction. When someone in a slum or workhouse died, their body was rarely given a grave of their own. Instead, corpses were piled into mass pits, sometimes dozens at a time, with no marker to tell the world they had ever lived. Even worse, many bodies never reached a cemetery at all. Resurrection men roamed the graveyards of Edinburgh and London, digging up the newly buried to sell them to medical schools. Families of the poor could not afford coffins with iron bars or watchmen to guard the grave, so their loved ones were stolen within days. I imagine the horror of a mother, standing over a fresh mound of earth, only to return later and find it disturbed. The body of her child sold off to a surgeon's table. In some cities, the poor were even told openly that their corpses would be claimed for dissection if they died in a hospital. Death, in that sense, became a final debt they could not escape. To me, that reveals the cruelest truth of all, that poverty followed people beyond the grave. And yet, these forgotten souls built the foundations of the world we live in today. Their labor, their suffering, and even their bodies were used to fuel the engines of industry and science. It makes me pause and wonder, how many stories remain buried? How many voices were silenced before they could ever be heard? As we close this journey through the hidden corners of the 19th century, I hope you carry with you not just the facts, but the human faces behind them. If this glimpse into the past moved you, please give this video a like, subscribe for more untold history, and share it so that these forgotten lives are remembered at last.